Keanu Reeves leaned back in his first-class seat, adjusting his black hoodie. The low hum of the engines filled the cabin, the scent of leather seats and expensive cologne mixing in the pressurized air. He wasn't one to seek luxury, but this was a long-haul flight, and he had a tight filming schedule ahead. Beside him, a man in his late 60s, clad in a pristine navy blue suit, checked his Rolex with a flick of the wrist. His silver hair was slicked back, his movements precise, calculated. He glanced at Keanu and let out a quiet scoff, just loud enough to be heard. "People like you don't belong here," he muttered, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Keanu turned, raising an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" The businessman didn't look at him. Private jets exist for a reason. First class is for real businessmen, those who built something, not those who got lucky pretending to be someone else on screen. Keanu studied him for a moment, then simply smiled. "It's going to be a long flight." The flight had barely taken off when the businessman's quiet contempt began evolving into something more palpable. He leaned back, stretching in a way that deliberately encroached on Keanu's space. He drummed his fingers against the armrest, both of them, as if silently claiming ownership of the shared boundary. Keanu, unfazed, simply adjusted his hoodie and gave a small, knowing smile. He had been in countless situations where arrogance filled the air like expensive cologne. This was just another performance. The businessman let out a deliberate sigh, shaking his head slightly, his way of broadcasting dissatisfaction to an audience that wasn't there. The energy between them was shifting, unspoken but unmistakable. A flight attendant approached, her polished smile unwavering. "Would you care for a drink, sir?" she asked politely. Langford, though Keanu didn't yet know his name, barely glanced at her. "Macallan 18, neat. And get it right this time." The flight attendant hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of unease crossing her face before she nodded and walked away. Keanu's expression remained neutral, but inside, something stirred. He had seen this before. The entitled tone, the dismissive attitude, people who believed service was servitude. "You know," Keanu said, his voice casual, "she's just doing a job." Langford turned his head slightly, a smirk tugging at his lips. "I expect a certain level of service you wouldn't understand." Keanu chuckled. "I think respect is free, actually." Langford narrowed his eyes. "And what do you know about real work? About building something? You just recite lines that other people write?" Keanu tilted his head, considering the man. "And yet, here we are, both in the same cabin. Maybe success isn't as one-dimensional as you think." The businessman's smirk flickered. For the first time, a slight hesitation in his otherwise unwavering arrogance. He studied Keanu for a moment, as if re-evaluating the weight of his presence. The flight attendant returned, carefully placing the glass of whiskey in front of Langford. "Your Macallan 18, sir." Langford took a sip, let it roll over his tongue, and then set the glass down with a slow, deliberate motion. "Barely passable," he muttered under his breath. Keanu's eyes flickered to the flight attendant, who pretended not to hear. Something about the way she straightened her apron suggested she was used to this treatment. Keanu exhaled slowly. He could ignore Langford's arrogance directed at him, but watching someone belittle another person just for the sake of it? That was harder to stomach. "I'm curious," Keanu said, turning back to Langford. "Do you ever stop to wonder how people see you?" Langford's lips twitched. "People like me don't care about that." Keanu leaned back. "Maybe that's the problem. The tension thickened between them, now a tangible force. Other passengers in first class were beginning to take notice, subtly turning their heads, pretending to be lost in their tablets or books, but undoubtedly listening in. Langford let out a sharp breath through his nose. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Reeves. You pretend to be heroes on screen. Have you ever actually built anything real? Created something with your own hands?" Keanu smiled slightly, amused at the assumption. "Funny thing about that, I do. Motorcycles, actually. Ever heard of Arch?" Langford hesitated. The name was familiar. He knew high-end engineering when he saw it. He knew the price tags on those machines. He hadn't expected this answer. Keanu continued, his voice level but firm. "I work on them myself. Hands in the grease, designing, refining, not just signing checks." Langford studied him carefully. This wasn't the response he had prepared for. And for the first time, Keanu saw it. The slightest crack in the man's shield of arrogance. For a long moment, Langford didn't speak. He swirled the remaining whiskey in his glass, lost in thought. Keanu wasn't pushing, just presenting an alternate reality, one where wealth wasn't the only measure of worth. Finally, Langford exhaled sharply and reached for the flight attendant call button. "Another round?" Keanu asked. Langford smirked. "Only if you're buying." Keanu grinned. "Deal." As the flight attendant returned, her tension visibly lower, Keanu noticed something different in Langford's expression. The conversation wasn't over, but the battlefield had shifted. The war of words had only begun. Hours passed, and the steady hum of the engines became a constant backdrop. Langford's fingers tapped against his laptop keys, his expression one of deep concentration. Every few minutes, he let out an irritated sigh, as if the digital world wasn't moving fast enough for him. Keanu, meanwhile, observed him quietly. There was a rhythm to the man's work. Fast, efficient, ruthless. "You ever stop to just enjoy what you've built?" Keanu finally asked. Langford didn't look up. "I don't have that luxury." "But you're here, aren't you? First-class seat, drink in hand, nothing to do but exist." Langford's smirk was brief. Existing isn't the same as enjoying. Keanu tilted his head, watching as Langford closed his laptop with an audible snap. "Let me guess. You think if you stop moving, you lose momentum. That stopping means slipping, and slipping means losing everything?" Langford finally looked at him, his sharp gaze locking onto Keanu's with something close to curiosity. "You say that like you understand." Keanu nodded. "I do. I know what it's like to keep running, because stopping means facing everything you've ignored." Langford scoffed. "That's cute. But I don't have the luxury of self-reflection. I built something that people depend on." Keanu shrugged. "Built it for them? Or for yourself?" The older man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a neatly folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, staring at what appeared to be a blueprint. "You know what this is?" Langford asked, handing it to Keanu. Keanu studied it, tracing the fine lines of a high-rise building. The name, Langford Tower, etched at the top. "A skyscraper?" Langford nodded. "It'll be the tallest in my portfolio, a symbol of everything I've accomplished." Keanu's lips pressed together. "And yet, you don't seem proud. You seem tired." Langford exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Because I am." Keanu folded the blueprint and handed it back. "Then maybe it's time to ask yourself why you keep going." Langford smirked bitterly. "You think success comes with a choice? You don't stop once you've started, Reeves. If you do, everything collapses." Keanu leaned back in his seat. I get it. But tell me this. When was the last time you did something that made you happy? Langford's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, but no answer came. That's what I thought, Keanu said softly. You've built an empire. But what about a life? Langford stared at him, something uncertain flickering in his usually calculating eyes. The hum of the engines, the clinking of glasses, the occasional chatter of other passengers, all faded into the background as Langford sat in silence. He turned the blueprint over in his hands as if searching for an answer that wasn't there. Finally, he sighed, folding the paper and tucking it back into his pocket. Maybe I've been so focused on building things for other people, I forgot to build anything for myself. Keanu nodded. Then maybe it's time to start. Langford gave him a long look, then leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling. The weight of years pressed down on him, but for the first time, he let himself feel it. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He was just here. A sudden, sharp jolt rocked the plane. The cabin lights flickered for a second and the overhead compartments rattled. A nervous murmur passed through the passengers. Keanu's hand instinctively gripped the armrest, but he remained calm. Across from him, Langford had gone rigid. His fingers clutched the leather armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. The plane rocked again, dipping slightly. A few passengers gasped. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected turbulence, the captain's voice announced over the speakers, attempting to sound reassuring. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. Langford exhaled sharply. His breathing was rapid, shallow. Keanu stole a glance at Langford. The man who had exuded arrogance and control looked different, almost vulnerable. His hands trembled slightly. Not a fan of flying? Keanu asked, his voice steady. Langford let out a hollow chuckle, but there was no humor in it. I hate it. Keanu nodded. Me too. Langford turned his head, surprised. You? But you've traveled everywhere. Keanu smiled slightly. Doesn't mean I like it, just means I do it anyway. Langford exhaled, his posture sinking slightly. For the first time in the flight, the mask he wore, the shield of superiority, began to crack. The turbulence worsened, sending a coffee cup toppling from a nearby tray. Langford's hands clenched into fists. His breathing became shallower. Keanu studied him carefully. What is it about flying that gets you? Langford hesitated, his eyes darting to the window. It's not the flying, it's the lack of control. Keanu nodded slowly. Ah, you don't like being a passenger? Langford gave a short, dry laugh. Something like that? The turbulence finally eased, but Langford's shoulders remained stiff. He took a shaky breath. It's funny, he muttered, staring at his fingers. I can dictate the fate of multi-million-dollar projects, control markets, and decide which city gets a new skyline. But sitting in a metal tube 30,000 feet in the air? Powerless. Keanu nodded. Sometimes life forces us to be passengers. Langford's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't respond, but something in his expression suggested that, for the first time in a long time, he was really thinking about it. A flight attendant approached with a reassuring smile. Would you like another drink, Mr. Langford? Langford stared at his half-finished whiskey. For the first time, he hesitated. Just water, please. Keanu's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. A small approving smile played at his lips. Langford exhaled and leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his silver hair. "I don't like feeling powerless," he admitted, "but maybe I've spent too much time trying to control everything." Keanu nodded. Letting go can be terrifying, but sometimes it's necessary. Langford let out a breath, this time less sharp, less forced. He wasn't sure what had shifted, but something had. And for the first time in years, he didn't immediately push the feeling away. The turbulence had subsided, but the unease lingered in Langford's expression. He loosened his tie, exhaling sharply as if shaking off a weight he had carried for too long. Keanu, ever observant, noticed the way Langford's hands trembled slightly, whether from the fading fear of turbulence or something deeper, he couldn't tell. "You ever wonder if it was worth it?" Langford asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. Keanu tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Langford stared at the ice melting in his whiskey glass. "Building an empire, making all the money in the world. I've got 3 ex-wives, kids who don't call me, and more enemies than friends. But hey, I'm in first class, so I guess I won, right?" Keanu studied him for a long moment. Success isn't just about what you build, it's about what you don't destroy in the process. Langford let out a short, bitter laugh. "Guess I failed at that part." Langford leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Do you know how many people I've had to step on to get where I am? How many friendships I sacrificed, deals I made, just to stay on top?" Keanu nodded slightly. "And do you ever think about what those choices cost you?" Langford scoffed. "I built a billion-dollar empire. I own more properties than I can count. But the only calls I get now are from lawyers, accountants, and journalists looking for a scandal." He took another sip of whiskey. "And when this flight lands, I'll be greeted by an assistant who probably hates me and a driver who won't say a word, unless I ask." Keanu remained quiet for a moment, then said, "Sounds lonely." Langford's grip on his glass tightened slightly. "Maybe." Keanu adjusted his seat, choosing his next words carefully. "I know a guy who once told me something that stuck with me. He said, if you win the game, but lose yourself, what was the point of playing?" Langford exhaled sharply. Wise words. "He's still around?" Keanu's expression darkened slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "No, he lost himself chasing something that never made him happy. And when he finally realized it, it was too late to fix things." Langford looked down at his glass, the ice now completely melted. "Maybe I should call my kids." Keanu smiled. "It's never too late." Langford sighed, his shoulders seeming a little less rigid now. "You think they'd even pick up?" Keanu shrugged. "Only one way to find out." Langford reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. He hesitated, then turned to Keanu. "You ever regret anything?" Keanu considered the question for a moment before answering. "Of course, but regrets only define you if you let them. It's what you do after that matters." Langford nodded slowly, then with a deep breath, he dialed a number. Keanu watched as the phone rang, a flicker of uncertainty crossing Langford's face. Then, a voice on the other end picked up. Langford's lips parted slightly. "Hey, it's me." Keanu turned away slightly, giving the man his moment. He knew this wasn't a Hollywood ending. There were no guarantees of reconciliation, no dramatic embrace waiting at the other end. But it was a start. Maybe, just maybe, Langford was ready to build something real. As the plane flew steadily through the night, the cabin lights dimmed. Most passengers had settled into a state of quiet relaxation. But Langford remained stiff, staring out the window at the vast darkness outside. Keanu noticed the businessman's clenched jaw, his fingers lightly tapping against the leather armrest. "Still thinking about that call?" Keanu asked. Langford exhaled. "Yeah. I haven't spoken to my son in 5 years," he answered, but it was cold, distant. Keanu nodded. "That's still better than silence." Langford scoffed. "Is it?" Keanu adjusted in his seat, choosing his words carefully. "You ever wonder why you got here? Not just in this plane, but in this place in life?" Langford let out a breath, shaking his head. "You make it sound like I lost control of my own life." "Maybe you did," Keanu said, his voice even. "Maybe power and wealth became your compass, and you forgot where you were really going." Langford let that sink in. He had spent decades climbing, always looking for the next acquisition, the next project. But sitting here, thousands of feet in the air, he realized he had never taken a moment to look down at what he had left behind. The flight attendant came by, offering more drinks. Langford waved her off. "No more whiskey, just water." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "That's a start." Langford exhaled. "You know, when I first saw you sitting here, I assumed you were just another celebrity wasting money on luxury. But you've spent more time listening to me than anyone I pay to be around me." Keanu chuckled. "That's because I don't have a stake in your business. I just care about people." Langford let out a dry laugh. "Maybe that's what I've been missing." For the first time in years, Langford allowed himself to sit in silence, but not the kind that weighed on his chest. This was different. It was a silence of realization, of acknowledgement. "I think I'm tired of playing the king," Langford admitted. "I built a kingdom, but no one lives in it with me." Keanu offered a small smile. "Then maybe it's time to rebuild something else." Langford nodded slowly, reaching for his phone once more. Not to check stock prices, not to send another soulless business email, but to try again, to make another call, to take another step. Keanu watched as Langford hesitated for only a moment before pressing dial. And this time, when the voice on the other end answered, Langford didn't hesitate to speak. The cabin lights brightened as the plane began its descent. The once tense air between Langford and Keanu had shifted into something resembling mutual understanding. The businessman, who had once exuded unshakable arrogance, now sat in quiet contemplation. Langford exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You know, Reeves, I never expected to have a conversation like this on a flight." Keanu smirked. "Neither did I." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Langford straightened in his seat. He hesitated before speaking. "Do you think it's too late to fix things?" Keanu shook his head. "It's never too late, but you have to want it." Langford nodded, his grip tightening around his phone. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about business meetings or stock prices. He was thinking about his family. The plane touched down smoothly. As passengers stood to collect their belongings, Keanu remained seated, watching Langford with quiet curiosity. Langford exhaled deeply and powered on his phone. Almost instantly, notifications flooded his screen. Missed calls, emails, messages. But this time, he ignored them. He scrolled through his contacts, hesitating for only a moment before pressing a name. Keanu stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Take care, Richard." Langford looked up, offering a small, genuine smile. "You too, Reeves, and thanks." Keanu nodded and made his way down the aisle. As he stepped off the plane, He glanced back once more, seeing Langford holding the phone to his ear, his expression uncertain but determined. A conversation that had started with disdain had ended with possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel.